and then relaxed. It reached out for the web to his left and started to pull itself up, off the ground and parallel to him. All Roger could see was the stinger beginning to throb, and he turned to his right, staring, tears welling up in his eyes.
"Help me!"
he stammered.
"Help me, please!"
Lisa stood back and watched as Kevin lay sprawled across the ground. He was about 4 feet away from the pitifully grotesque gargoyle that rested upon the glass, holding it firmly shut, and he had one ear pressed against the roof of the crypt, his eyes closed and tensely focused. "Everything is quiet down there," Kevin said, his voice barely a whisper. "There's nothing moving in the mausoleum." But even as he spoke, she could see the darkness pressed against the other side of the glass, looking one moment like smoke and the next like some fleshy black mass squished against the barrier that, for some unassailable yet wondrous reason, refused it access across the periphery. The darkness moved from time to time, rhythmically, regularly, and she imagined that it was the motion of the monstrosity breathing. "Come over here and listen," Kevin told her, his voice still low and seemingly far away. She shook her head, and so he opened his eyes and glared at her in a look that gave her no choice but to oblige. Keeping a hard distance from the skylight, she leaned down and pressed her right ear against the cold and blocky stone. There was no sound initially, but after a moment she began to hear the sound of wind, slowly moving as if through a tunnel. "Do you hear that?" Kevin asked her. She nodded. "It's something deeper than the crypt." He closed his eyes again for a moment and then raised his head up slightly, propping it against the palm for support. "Tell me, Lisa, have you ever heard of Gaia?" "No," was all she could muster. "Technically, I'm referring to the Gaia hypothesis. It's actually fairly complicated, but to put it in layman's terms, it suggests that the Earth is, in a way, alive." "What do you mean alive?" "I mean that the Earth is a living organism, one that grows and changes and..." He glanced down at the ground, then repositioned his ear against it. "And breathes," he said slowly. "It may sound crazy, but it's in the Bible, in a way." "What? You don't believe me?" "It's when the Israelites are wandering in the desert. This one man leads a rebellion against Moses, and in one movement, he, his family, and his followers are swallowed by the hungry earth. The earth opened its jaws and ate them all." Kevin's gaze was becoming more intense, and Lisa tried to raise herself up, but Kevin quickly grabbed her by her arm and then held her down. "Listen," he ordered, using his strength to force her. "Listen. Can you hear it? Beyond the breath, it's the greater depth, the sound of something else." Lisa wanted nothing more than to pull away from him and scramble to the other side of the roof, but she knew she wasn't strong enough. So she did as he commanded and pressed her ear once again against the rough and broken stone. She listened past the rushing wind and through the rock, and she could hear something else, something faint but rhythmic, a groaning so methodical that it almost sounded like a metronome. There was a faint rasp, as of gas released from hydraulics, the churning of some unknown piece of clockwork far below the crypt. "It's Gaia," he told her. "It's the machinery of the earth. For what is the earth if not the greatest living machine?" He released his grip on her arm as she scrambled to her feet and backed away quickly from him. Slowly, ever so dreadfully slowly, Kevin rose to his and stared at her with wide eyes. He continued to stare at her as he walked over to the edge of the crypt's roof and finally tore his eyes away from her. It was only when Korah was swallowed that the Israelites were saved. You see, in those arcane days, they knew the meaning of sacrifice. They knew that a starving desert of an earth needed to be fed. It's a machine, organic, crafted by the hands of the Most High, and so it demands what he demands. Water won't do, neither the fruit of the land or clothes or gold. It needs the oil of humanity, the stuff that holds the life. It must be fed, Lisa, It should be fed with blood. Kevin suddenly lunged for her, throwing his arms out like claws, scraping at her skin, her clothes, her hair, and she tried to whip him away with her arms. She twisted and scrambled out of his grasp, and he yelled an indistinguishable roar at her. But the roar devolved into a frenzied mess of jumbled words, only some of which she could make out. Spittle flew from his mouth as he chased after her, and at last, he caught her in the corner, wrapping both hands around her neck. He turned her to her side and forced her to stare down at the ground. "Do you see it?" he cried, almost more animal than man. "Do you see how thirsty it is?" And indeed, she could see that the ground looked almost scorched, with great cracks spreading out like blistered and broken skin. As she stared, the ground almost seemed to shimmer. "It's reacting," he whispered, his voice dropping low. "It only swallowed Korah because he brought rebellion into the hearts of the Israelites. And now, we, you, me, Charlie, we let something out. And it's tearing a hole in creation." His grip tightened around her throat, causing her to whimper in pain as he pushed her ever closer to the edge. There's another world bleeding through, and it's corrupting the earth, sucking the life from it. So we need to give it some of that fuel back. If we want the earth to survive, then we need to feed the machine, Lisa. But before he had a chance to push her over the edge, she jabbed her elbow into his gut, right below his sternum, knocking the wind out of the lunatic. His grip on her neck loosened enough for her to break free, and without thinking, she shouldered him in the chest, knocking him off balance. She stumbled backward and dropped to the floor, where she grabbed his left shin, gripping the meat of his leg as hard as she could and lifted, toppling the man sideways over the barrier demarcating the edge of the roof. He spun over the parapet, but held onto the stonework as he dangled in the air. Pity took her momentarily as she reached out to grab his hand to try to keep him from falling. His head was turned to the ground, but when she took his hand, he turned back to her and she saw the same manic look in his eyes. "Can you hear him?" Kevin asked, grasping for air between each word. Then he picked up speed and spat the rest of his gibbering, incoherent thoughts. Silent footsteps in the dark. His eyes flashed like fog, startling Lisa, and she relaxed her grip. Kevin slid loose and fell the 3 stories to the ground, hitting it with a hard and sickening crunch as joints exploded and bones shattered. Blood pooled out of his mouth and his eyes and ears, and the foggy eyes were drowned in pools of crimson which looked as dark as the near lightless sky. There was a rumble before she had a chance to pull her gaze away. The ground began to quake, the cracks rapidly closing up on themselves, and then, as Lisa looked on in horror, the ground around Kevin began to spread apart, a new fault opening up with him in the center. Only this fault didn't stretch on like a crack, but bulged in the middle, and crater walls rose up around him. Bones slid into view from beneath the earth, lining up like jagged teeth around the body of her friend turned attacker. Soon it became apparent to her that it was no mere canyon forming, but the gaping maw of the earth itself. Like a limp doll, Kevin slid down a widening tunnel beyond the bony teeth, beyond the bones of humans long since dead and buried. Before he disappeared completely, she could see strange skeletal masses that resembled nothing she had ever seen, the fragmented remains of things before the age of man. And then, in a fraction of a terrible moment, the body of Kevin was gone into the gaping mouth, which began to slowly close. The bones disappeared, the teeth retracting inward like fangs past their use, and the maw became a crater, which became little more than a crack in the ground. Before it closed completely, however, there was a putrid odor as black smoke issued forth, drifting across the sparse grass, floating among the tombstones, never dissipating but moving, and seeming to grow stronger as it did. Lisa watched, frozen in place, as the darkness reached the edge of the cemetery. But there it stopped, building up in mass. It was the gate surrounding the graveyard. The fog could not cross the iron barrier.